You've probably never tasted a single dish from the 1600s, and you're missing out on 400 years of forgotten flavor. From spiced meats fit for royalty to bizarre desserts lost to time, these recipes reveal how people cooked, survived, and celebrated centuries ago. Let's dig in. Cock ale was a really unusual beer. It was something that was brewed in England for at least 2 straight centuries, which is more than enough time to reconsider this. But did logic ever knock them on the head? It was made by taking an old rooster, some additional spices like raisins, nutmeg, and mace, and then boiling it all together. The resulting broth was pungent, too strong almost. People believed the infusion was supposed to basically amplify the medicinal and nutritional properties of the ale. You would take a malty beer, the rooster would be boiled until the flesh fell apart, the spices would be melted, and a sack was thrown in to boost the overall alcohol content. They thought cock ale would enhance strength and act as a restorative tonic. I'm not really sure if any of that is true, and if you're familiar with this kind of folk medicine, then please drop some insight in the comments. But what can a rooster do for my strength that a T-bone steak and pull-ups can't? Ambergris pudding was a really luxurious dessert from the 16th and 17th century. It was infused with ambergris, which was a really rare ingredient that could only be obtained from the digestive system of a sperm whale. So, yeah. If you've ever played one of those video games where they make you fetch a legendary item from some super obscure out-of-the-way place, this is that. Ambergris had a really sweet, marine-like, musky aroma that was used in a lot of European-style dishes. It was used in desserts, beverages, and custards. A pretty typical recipe for ambergris pudding looked a lot like cream, milk, egg yolks, ambergris, warm spices, and just butter. The interesting part was that the cooking was done in a buttered cloth if it was boiled, or an earthenware dish if it was baked. The ambergris would be thrown in at the very end to make sure that was the dominating aroma in the dessert and nothing else. It was really expensive, and it was also considered a sign of wealth. As a result, it was mostly only the nobility who would enjoy this dish at really elaborate banquets and big events that were about flexing your money. Salmagundi was a really decorative and elaborate dish in its own right. It was a cold salad dish that was really just all the rage in the later end of the 16th century. This was a pretty compact dish, and it had a well-rounded element to it. You had pickles, eggs, vegetables, meats, all arranged in a very exotic and eye-catching presentation. People thought the name was actually a play on the recipe, because in French it means a dangerous mixture of ingredients, which is exactly what it is. Modern salads are pretty minimalistic, but Salmagundi was all about going over the top. It was layered and sculpted instead of being tossed. The dish was assembled on a large platter, and the meat would form the center while the rest of the ingredients would surround it in a spiral. Some people even added edible flowers to add more of a vibe to it. It was definitely a dish for grand banquets for the high aristocracy, and it eventually became something that was really popular in American colonies, especially among wealthy naval officers. On the other hand, there were also sailors who would just throw whatever they had and make this, so you had an entire spectrum of Salmagundi you could experience depending on your social class. Let's switch it up with the savory side of things. The perfect dish to do that with is umble pie, which was a meat pie that was made from offal meat. The offal would be deer, and the heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys were all common ingredients thrown in this. This was actually something that was the opposite of wealthy food, as you can probably tell, since it's based around offal. This used to be served to lower-class peasants and servants because those cuts of offal meat were considered cheap, tough, and undesirable, so they would be saved for them. The umbles were minced as finely as they could be and were stewed with onions, spices, and sometimes even wine. Then, a thickened gravy was made by combining the stewed meat with a broth. Sometimes people would thicken it with more egg yolks to give it a velvety texture. The pastry crust would basically be a sturdy, lard-based crust that would work like a modern pot pie or also like an open tart. Some versions threw raisins in, but those didn't do too well. Now, personally, this is far too gamey and metallic tasting just from the description for me, but I'm sure some meatheads will love it. Sack posset was a really nice custard-like drink from the 16th century. It's one of those dishes that I wouldn't mind seeing again at all. It was made by curdling hot cream or milk, whichever you had, with a sack. This was a kind of fortified wine, and the closest example I can give you is sherry. It was seen as a medicinal tonic for colds and other common illnesses, but it was also seen as a luxurious dessert. Not sure how something ends up being that. But anyway, the wine was often malaga, and you had to use heavy cream back then. The sack had to be heated really gently with sugar and spices, and then the milk was scalded. Once the process was done, people would leave the posset to sit sometimes. It would form 3 layers, which would be a boozy base, the perfect thing to have at the end of the meal. The middle layer would be hot, curdled cream or milk, and the top would be very creamy. Overall, it was a wonderful dish that really made you feel like you had an amazing custard. Rook pie was also a savory meat pie, but this time, instead of the usual assortment of livers, kidneys, and other organs farmed from deer, you had rooks. These were a kind of bird that belonged to the crow family, and you've probably seen them at some point without realizing it. They used to be a really common source of meat, especially in rural communities and places that were on the outskirts of large settlements. It was free food, so it's not like anybody really complained. The pie was super popular among the middle class too, and some of the wealthy people back then even ate it when meat used to be running low. People preferred young rooks because the meat was more tender, and the gamey flavor was less pronounced. The birds had to be cleaned and everything, so it was a pretty time-consuming process. Most people parboiled the birds after and made a gravy filling that they added to a lard-based crust. This would be baked until it was perfectly golden, and there you had it. Now, I can't say for sure how good of a pie this is, but I just don't think anything to do with crows wouldn't taste good. Hedgehog pudding was this really sweet molded dessert that actually looked a lot more like a hedgehog than it did a proper dessert. I know you might have expected some badass survivalist recipe that actually involved hedgehogs, but this is just a sweet little treat. It was honestly something the kids loved, and it was something home chefs back then loved to make as well. You need a few different things to get the shape of the pudding right so that it would actually resemble a hedgehog. Then you'd make the spine with blanched almonds and/or candied citrus peels. People usually threw in some chocolate for the extra touch. It was largely something that was reserved for wealthy households though, because most people back then just weren't going to be affording things like that. Still, it was a pretty delicious taste that was one of the nicer ones to come out from the 16th century. I mean, I'd definitely eat a hedgehog-shaped pudding. Stargazy pie is a dish that's all about the drama and the flair. This is a Cornish fish pie that's as elaborate and over the top as they come. I mean, where else do you see entire fish heads and tails coming out from the crust? Now, that metal. While there's no proper documentation about who invented this wonderful little display of bone art, most people definitely believe that it was a 16th century dish that was associated with mousehole. This is because of the legend of Tom Bawcock. As the story goes, Tom saved his entire village from starvation by catching a world record-setting haul of sardines. The fishy cherry on top? He did the whole thing during a storm. Because, of course he did. Still, let's talk about what we do now. So the pie usually involved mackerel and herring, and the chefs took great care to end to damage the tails and heads during the gutting process. People always preferred sweat-based doughs because they thought the flavor of the sweet went along better with the fish. Now, on the inside, you had hard-boiled eggs, bacon, sometimes bits of salt pork, and onions, plus mustard, white sauce, and cream. It was a pretty decadent mixture, and if you're a die-hard seafood fan, it's the dish for you. Coastal communities in Cornwall treasured the recipe, especially during holidays like Tom Bawcock's Eve, which falls on the 23rd of December. Interesting traditions, right? Beef marrow toast was a pretty indulgent dish, the kind of thing you'd take someone out for when you really wanted to impress them. As it was, the dish was a favorite of upper-class English households during the American colonies. Bone marrow was something that was always really popular in European cuisine after all. It was prized for the deep, buttery flavor, and most people also considered it a very nutritious meal. Beef shin and femur bones in particular were prized for their invigorating aspects. Those were also the ones that were used for these toasts, and the seasonings were pretty light. The dish really emphasized on the natural flavor of the bone marrow. The thin slices of bread would be laden with eggs or cream, but nothing more than that. Maybe they'd be fried in beef drippings, but usually people just went with butter. The marrow would be spread onto the toasts, and to finish it all off, grated Parmesan would be placed on the top. It sounds like a pretty good lunch, to be honest. Would you go for it? Or would you just stick to peanut butter and jelly? Pottage was this stew that had been slow cooked for so long that you would honestly need 2 other meals to pass the time by until it was ready. Still, when it was done, ITW is something that nobody wanted to miss out on. It had already been a staple food for people of pretty much every background, poor or rich, and it had been that way for centuries. Even in the 16th century, it was a fundamental part of people's daily diet. The ingredients varied, though. They involved a lot of things that were seasonal. Plus, despite it being available to all backgrounds, that didn't mean pottage was consistently made throughout all of them. Typically, a poor man's cottage was just a vegetable dish that was thickened with lots of beans and grains. On the other hand, pottage in a well-off home had things like rabbit meat, seafood, and it would be served with all kinds of spices, both local and exotic, and wine. That's almost a different meal entirely. Still, the method for it remained the same. A pot would sit on a fire all day, like literally all day. The ingredients would be added one by one as the pot gradually heated up, and the ones that were added stewed. The pottage process was something that went on for hours for a specific purpose. The end result was this stew that blended flavors together into one unique new flavor profile. It was an experience that's hard to describe unless you've ever had stews that have been simmering for hours and hours. Barley gruel was a really nourishing dish that was made by just boiling barley INW8er, milk, and some spices until it was thicky end. This was both medicinal food as well as a typical 16th century breakfast. It was something that people gave to their children all the time. You could consider it that time period's equivalent of cereal, just without, all the cereal. More importantly, rosewater helped to really make this dish stand out a little bit more. On its own, Tay gruel didn't have much to offer on all fronts. It didn't look too good, it didn't smell like anything that would catch your attention, and it tasted okay. Rosewater gave it a nice floral aroma. Besides that, people added sugar, honey, and milk to help make the gruel a bit more nicer as far as the taste went. The barley had to be washed and soaked overnight, though, and it was something that was simmering in water for several hours. Also, you might not believe it, but monks often ate this. Something about detaching yourself from worldly desires and all that. Barley gruel itself goes back several centuries, but it was a big staple throughout the 16th as well. Lamprey is an extremely interesting dish, mostly because of the sauce that comes with it. You may already be guessing what kind, but I promise you won't figure it out. Lamprey itself was a jawless fish that was a lot similar to an eel than anything else. One of the best ways to prepare lamprey was to actually serve it in a spicy, wait for it, blood sauce. Yes, the sauce was made of actual blood. The lamprey's blood was very carefully collected and conserved, while it was mixed with vinegar, red wine, and spices so that the blood won't coagulate. The base of the broth was made out of wine, onions, and herbs, and the blood mixture was actually thrown into that broth with some butter. It ended up thickening as a result, and it would then be served along with the lamprey. Pretty gruesome, right? The sauce really tasted metallic too. I mean, obviously. You're drinking blood. I swear, man, some of these things are way better than having several centuries worth of space from me. Capons were castrated roosters, and they were actually prized for how tender and rich the meat could get when you boiled it. As a result, boiled capno, particularly with almond milk, became something of a delicacy of the times. It was mostly that way because you would always see this being served in wealthy households. Not just that, you'd also see it being served in royal courts, so it really turned into a bit of a status symbol. Almond milk was something that really complemented the capon with its nutty flavor and creamy texture, but the best bit was definitely still the capon itself. The bird was thoroughly plucked, cleaned, and trussed before it would be boiled into a mixture. This mixture would contain different herbs like bay leaves, thyme, and parsley, along with water and white wine. Now, while this would simmer, you'd get the almond milk ready, which wasn't just some plain old almond milk. No, these were blanched almonds. Secondly, tahi had been ground into a fine paste with wine and were then mixed with the broth from the capon. You'd let that sit for a bit and get the sauce, and then it was pretty much ready. It sounds like a pretty good dish if I'm being honest. Flummery, on the other hand, was a different kind of thrill. This was a delicate, jelly-like pudding that had been made entirely from boiled oatmeal or ground wheat. Once those were thickened, they'd be set aside to cool down. The point was to get them to take a really nice gelatinous texture, which was a delight to eat. It was actually a simple peasant dish that devolved into a more refined version when it started to get popular in cities and eventually in wealthier circles. It wouldn't be served molded or anything. It was just sliced jelly that had been served with cream and fruit, but some versions tried to layer it with custard. There were also flavorings and sweeteners like rose water, orange blossom water, and cinnamon. Everyone always put in honey and sugar, but some of the richer people would throw in wine-soaked raisins. Still, it was a dish that remained accessible to everyone no matter how bare bones or elaborate of an attempt you were going for. Flummery's a pretty cute name too, isn't it? Peacock roasts were a really theatrical dish. They were something that would be served at noble banquets and royal feasts, and it was there where their popularity peaked in the medieval period. It was even a status symbol of the wealthy going into the 17th century too. Peacock has always remained that way, as a sign of opulence and old money. It was also a dish that was prized honestly more for the spectacle of having it than for the taste of it. The meat was really gamey, the texture was tough, it needed an incredible amount of seasoning so it would become tolerable to most taste buds, but that wasn't why people came to have it. They came for the thrill of seeing a peacock presented for the theme extravagantly, featuring all kinds of decorations like gilded accents and the original feathers as part of the presentation. The feathers were actually pretty carefully preserved, plus a lot of people would keep the head intact for display. This honestly sounds like a bit too much showing off for me, like just eat your food, you know? But hey, different centuries, different folks, different strokes. It really had to be seasoned a lot though. I mean, people were putting in unreasonable amounts of salt, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Peacocks were never really something that had been known for their taste, though they were always something that drew attention and spectacle towards them. Bone marrow custard was an extremely prized ingredient in the 16th century. It was something that people valued especially for how rich it was. The silkiness of the bone marrow and the medicinal benefits that people thought came with it made it one of the most appetizing choices to go for. Bone marrow custard was something that was a cross between sweet and savory, which I'm sure is hard to imagine for a lot of you. Don't get me wrong, I don't really get how the flavor of bone marrow can mesh with any kind of sweetness either. Especially veal bones, which is what was used here. The base of the custard was pretty typical. You had egg yolks, sugar, nutmeg, cinnamon, and a bit of rose water for flavor, and then the softened marrow, after being soaked in warm water, would be added. People would serve it warm or cold, and they'd usually put candied fruits in there as well. In most cases, it was just a filling for pastry tarts, but people really loved the custard version as well. Pancakes with snow were a really light and airy dessert that had pancakes topped with whipped egg whites. They were sweetened and flavored with citrus and rose water, which is something you'll see a lot of throughout this list. It was a pretty elegant dish, the kind of thing you would serve at festivals and family gatherings. It was also apparently extremely popular with children. The pancake aspect of this was as typical as you would expect. They were your run-of-the-mill pancakes with your standard batter, except this time they had some sack thrown in. Again, a sack is U.S. fortified wine, in case you forgot. Now, the mixture itself was cinnamon, lemon zest, and nutmeg, which is an odd collaboration of spices, I'll admit, but let's give it a shot. Now, the snow aspect here is where it gets really interesting. The egg whites were whisked into these peaks, which were really stiff. Mind you, these people were manually doing all this since wooden whisks weren't a thing yet. Then, sugar would be folded in for added sweetness, and the whipped whites were mixed with cream to make a sort of mousse-like texture. The pancakes would then be layered with this snow on the top before being served, and there you have it. Butterbeer was a very rich, spiced, and slightly sweetened hot drink that was extremely popular in England from the 1500s to the 1600s. It was something that actually was really popular throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. People would serve it warm, which isn't what you typically want for your beer. I won't lie to you, but such were the times. This beverage was also enriched with butter, sugar, and eggs, which made it a frothy, spicy ale custard. Yes, I know that sounds like a very weird combination of words. It was something that people always had in the winter though, so now you know why they never served it cold. Still, I would have preferred it cold. As far as the local pubs and taverns went though, this thing was all the rage, especially during the winter. The mixture of egg yolks would be whisked into this thick custard-like foam that would then be served on top of the drink itself. The sweeteners like honey were really great at bringing out the best of the butter, and it was also something that really brought back life to the sick. Maybe next time I'll throw some butter in my Miller Lite. Blood pudding pie was a really savory dish that was made with a lot of unsavory ingredients, to say the least. It was also exactly what it sounds like. Yes, this did include actual animal blood. It also had sweet and spices, and they were encased in flaky pastry crusts. These were an early variation of blood pudding, which was presented mostly in pie form. The reason people stuck to keeping it in pie form was so that it would be easy to carry and be transportable. Now, here's where it starts to get really icky, so bear with me, okay? The blood base was actually a fresh pig or cow's collected blood that had been mixed with liquid so it wouldn't clot. Next, people threw in oatmeal in hare or barley so that the blood could be absorbed into them and then made into a really thick, pudding-like texture. Civet is basically UST-rendered beef or pork fat, but the rest of it is one extremely meat-based combination. I mean, there were seasonings in there, and some pies tried to go the extra mile by having sugar, currants, and nutmeg, but none of that really would sell most people on it from even some of the recent centuries before ours. There's just something about blood in your food that doesn't make a lot of sense, especially in the "I need to eat this right now" kind of way. The next thing on the list is as much of a curiosity as it is an atrocity, but let's go with it anyway. Calf's foot jelly was a gelatinous dish that was actually made from boiling the feet of calves to draw out the natural gelatin that was in there. This would then be flavored with wine and citrus, and it was something people considered a luxurious dessert. Lots of people thought that it also helped to boost digestion, but no one ever really looked into how true that is. I suppose they wouldn't, on account of nobody eating calf's feet anymore. A calf's foot would have to be boiled for hours in the water until the gelatin would get out. The cartilage, tendons, and the bones would break down completely as they released it. It was a pretty grimy affair, really. Sugar on its own was something that people added, though I'm not sure how much it really sweetened the pot, literally. Citrus juice was also common, and wine, especially sherry, was often thrown in there to help boost the flavor. The mixture would be boiled again and strained through a cloth before being served, so the whole thing really took a lot out of you. Probably the hardest anyone's ever had to work for feet, right? Gilded marchpane was a high-class dish that reflected the status of your wallet pretty well. That is to say, you were stupid rich if you were eating this. Marzipan would usually be decorated with intense amounts of gold leaf. Besides that, the second biggest and the most unavoidable cost was the mountain of sugar you would need to make this work. It was so much that it was pretty much a rich people-only dish, but it wasn't something enjoyed by them. Chefs rarely get the chance to work on a recipe that they're fully invested in and challenged by. For a lot of people, marzipan was that dish that let them express their creative side. Chefs would make intricate and detailed designs out of it, such as coats of arms, castles, weapons, and grand structures. All of this would be decorated with more gold leaf, so the decor on this alone racked up a few people's monthly expenses. It was served at lavish banquets as a show of wealth and hospitality, but this is just a dish that proves a point and wins you brownie points. It doesn't actually taste all that good. I mean, at least not as good as it looks. So a venison pasty was just a spiced meat pie, and it also emphasized using deer meat over everything else. Not that everyone followed those guidelines, though. People would switch out the deer meat for lamb or beef sometimes. For additional flavorings, people would often throw in spices and wine or ale for a bit of extra flavor. Venison pasty was something that only the rich and elite would get. They were usually the only ones with access to constantly maintained hunting grounds, and they usually were given hunting rights that gave them clearance to hunt deer. Otherwise, it was illegal due to forestation and animal protection laws. You would see these pasties in Tudor feasts as often as you would see them in a hunter's backpack, so it was a really well-rounded meal that could fit a lot of different contexts. Poaching deer was a serious crime, so if somebody was openly serving venison, then they were pretty well connected or well loaded, or often both. Goose and prune stew was a dish that was suited to the wealthy upper class of the 16th century. That era saw a lot of European exploration of American land, and with that, they managed to leave a decent bit of their own customs behind. One of these was the acquired taste of goose stew, which actually did pretty well in America. French settlers relied a lot on wild fare they could catch, especially goose. Wild geese were pretty plentiful in North America, so it makes sense why they thought to take advantage of the natural game that was available, instead of European spices like saffron, which were hard to get. Native American herbs such as juniper and sassafras were a lot more available as substitutes. A lot of preparation methods involved cooking and browning the vegetables in the animal fat collected from the geese. The addition of sweet prunes at the end gave the dish the perfect contrast it needed, making an incredible dish that could be enjoyed in the winter or the summer. Civet of hare is actually a dish that we got from traditional European cuisine. It's something that most people associate with French delicacies, but sadly, even this one has a fair amount of blood in it. All the herbs and seasonings in the world don't really shake that fact, honestly. Such were the culinary preferences of the 16th century. People used French cooking techniques here as well, such as slow cooking and rich, powerful sauces. This was a dish that was used as a statement about your social influence. Only the nobility could freely hunt in those times. What they did hunt was always reserved for their grand balls and feasts, including civet of hare. The onion-based sauce mixed with the red wine meant a very thick gravy that was exploding with flavor. The marination process and the choice to sear the hare in lard or butter with bacon also contributed heavily to its overall flavor. The marinade would then be strained and added back into the pot with just a bit more wine for safety. The end result was most likely one of the best renditions of a rabbit-based stew we've ever witnessed, and it's a shame that this recipe had to vanish from history. Sheep's head broth was an extremely rustic soup that was made from the boiled head of a sheep, alongside vegetables and grains. It was most commonly eaten by farmers, especially Scottish and English immigrants. It was apparently a long-standing tradition there to have this. You might be wondering about whether or not a sheep head is even edible. And I mean, we've seen other heads being used on this list, but maybe this one's finally the one that took it too far. Sadly, nope. The head was cleaned as thoroughly as possible, and the brains would be removed and used in separate recipes, because leave nothing behind. The skull itself was split in half so that it would cook faster, which is pretty macabre. The head itself would boil in a stock of onions, leeks, carrots, and turnips, and sometimes it would have grains like oats, rice, and barley in it so that the soup would thicken. After hours of cooking, most of the meat on the head would eventually soften up to a tolerable degree. The meat would still have to go through another round of slow cooking so that it would be completely okay though. Most people in the 16th century didn't really do much to spice this up, they just ate it plain, especially during the winter. The real joy of this meal was apparently the way it reinvigorated. One of those plates of food that just seemed to put life back into your step? This was one of those. As far as the flavor went though, it's about the same as what you're probably imagining, intensely gamey, with slight notes of iron, and it's a little too on the savory side for a lot of people's tastes. Even black in the 16th century, people would take a lot of care to add just the right amount of seasonings and stock because the recipe was already too flavorful, almost to the point it was overwhelming.
Veracruz, right?
If you're looking to bring the vibrant flavors of Mexico straight to your plate, red snapper veracruz is the perfect choice, or at least it was back in the day. This dish was incredibly popular in mid-20th century America, especially in areas with a strong Mexican influence. The best part? It looked just as good as it tasted. This dish was so famous across North America that it was often called the signature dish of the state of Veracruz. While red snapper is the traditional choice, the Veracruz-style sauce was also used with other types of fish or seafood, such as tilapia or shrimp, in some famous variations of the dish. This one has completely disappeared from menus in America, but if you'd still like a taste, a ticket to Mexico sounds like a plan. Ever wondered what kind of dish you'd see at a Michelin star restaurant in the 1950s and 1960s? The only right answer is halibut steaks with hollandaise. Hollandaise sauce is one of the 5 mother sauces in French cuisine, originating from the 17th century. It's made from the classic ingredients, egg yolks, butter, and lemon juice. This dish also came with many health benefits in each spoonful. Halibut is a lean fish that provides high-quality protein and essential nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, and B vitamins. Now, the big question comes to mind: why did it fall off the tables? Well, you can say it was healthy, but just not healthy enough. There were concerns about the dietary cholesterol and fat intake in dishes with rich sauces like hollandaise, and people decided to steer clear of them for a while. The sad part is that we never found our way back to this delicious dinner. Braised oxtail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took "eat your skincare" to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing: eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe, such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. Want to go for another odd dish that brightens the mood up at parties, holidays, and feasts alike? Broccoli cheese casserole was the American populace's answer to concerns about how the diet of kids these days just does not have enough green at them. The age-old question of how do we make broccoli taste as good as a cheeseburger still stood pretty firm though, and one genius in the 1800s had the bright idea of mixing broccoli into a casserole. As you must be quite familiar with by now, America tends to add cheese to anything it can see, so it does not take a lot to figure out how this came to be. A creamy sauce with fresh broccoli florets and cheese crackers are a tried and tested 1900s combo.
Like a masterpiece at all, I know, but this is leftover cod.
If you grew up in a New England household or anywhere along the East Coast, chances are you've heard of codfish balls. These crispy balls were made from salted cod and mashed potatoes and were a common dish in American homes, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Not only in homes, but it was the go-to snack at the beach and the one thing you could get at seafood shacks without spending any big bucks. They were often served with a simple white sauce or even ketchup, which made them a hit amongst both kids and adults. Plus, it was an ingenious way to use up preserved fish and stretch ingredients during lean times. Yeah, they really stuck with us through thick and thin. Codfish balls were a key part of the diet during the Great Depression due to their affordability and the accessibility of cod. Sadly, these bad boys have fallen out of flavor. There was a time when Scandinavian American communities would do anything for a taste of pickled herring in wine sauce. It was just that good. I mean, just think about the combination of tangy, slightly sweet pickled herring and rich wine sauce. I don't know about you, but it sounds like the perfect festive dish to me and a well-deserved break from casseroles. Can you imagine Thanksgiving without your grandma's famous turkey roast? Well, back in the day, roast goose was the traditional holiday dish. It was cooked using dry heat with hot air enveloping it evenly on all sides. Now, this is a dish I can get behind. Juicy, crispy skin, tender meat, and a flavorful stuffing. What's not to love? This dish was normally served with plum sauce to augment its flavor. It was particularly popular in England, where it was often served with applesauce and bread sauce instead. In Guangdong and Hong Kong, roast goose was a variety of siu mei, or roasted meat dishes, within Cantonese cuisine. It was made by roasting geese with seasoning, often in a charcoal furnace at high temperatures. This dinner isn't common anymore, but with a little effort, you can still find fresh goose and recreate this classic dish at home. Perhaps the classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the... Here is a dish that you have probably heard of one too many times but never gotten enough of: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Let's just say that comfort cooking really does not get much higher than this, nor more relaxing. Sitcoms, movies, and comedies across the decades that depict middle-class families always have somebody serving up a killer meatloaf, and it is for good reason. Our generation's parents always grew up eating a hearty meatloaf with a side of perfectly mushy soft potatoes, so it is no wonder that they kept the custom going. Today, mashed potatoes have an 85% popularity rate, which even beats hamburgers and cheeseburgers. You would think that those would be America's top one, but it seems nothing can beat Grand's meatloaf classics.
I'm gonna try my first piece.
So back in the early 20th century, broiled shad was a staple on American dinner tables, especially during the spring shad runs. Shad is a type of herring, and it was plentiful along the East Coast, making it an accessible and popular choice. It wasn't just a dish on our tables. It was a bonding experience for big families who'd gather for meals centered around this particular fish. Now, the best part about this fish is that it was considered flavorful enough not to require sauces, herbs, or spices. A filling of breadcrumbs was enough to add some crispiness. This fish could be boiled, filleted, fried in butter, or baked. Traditionally, a little vinegar was sprinkled over it on the plate. In the eastern United States, roe shads were prized because the eggs were considered a delicacy. These were typically broiled alongside the fish and added a savory flavor to the mix. Now, you can't really have a conversation about forgotten fish dishes without bringing up the infamous baked stuffed fish. The beauty of this dish was in its versatility. Yeah, you could use almost any fish, from cod to flounder, and the stuffing was often a mix of breadcrumbs, herbs, and sometimes a bit of seafood like shrimp or crab. Baking added a healthy twist to this dinner meal, as it's far better than frying. Yeah, baking is a healthier alternative to frying, as it uses less oil and fat, and stuffing and baking fish help retain moisture and flavor while keeping the dish light and nutritious. So, this was a labor-intensive meal, and as Grandma's cooking started becoming less common, we started seeing it less and less on dinner tables until it finally disappeared.
That doesn't sound like...
It is traditionally served with turnips and potatoes. Back in the day, haggis was popular everywhere around the globe, but it's limited to only Scotland now. While haggis might not be everyone's cup of tea, it's definitely a dish worth trying at least once. We're back to the basics with this one as boiled mutton. Who doesn't love some boiled mutton? This dish exists in almost every part of the world, with every culture having its own unique variation. The mutton was often placed in a large pot with root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes, slow-cooked until the meat fell apart and the vegetables were tender. This dish was the perfect meal to warm your insides on a cold winter day. Boiled mutton emerged as a common meal in medieval Europe, especially for the lower classes where it was cooked only using meat and water. Now, this one is slowly becoming more and more outdated as people usually go for more flavorful meats. But with the rise of Chinese hot pots, instant boiled mutton might just make a comeback. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. If you ever found yourself wondering what people did to celebrate fall back in the days of your grandparents, then wonder no longer, because we have the answer. Dishes like butternut squash mac and cheese fulfilled that craving of comfort food that the fall season tends to bring, while also being new and fresh enough to keep things interesting. Mac and cheese is already known for being pretty creamy texture-wise, but the squash just takes that and amplifies it tenfold. Also, it sneaks in some sweetness in there too, which really brings the entire dish full circle. This dish is a favorite of people who are in their 40s or 50s, and they would always go overboard with the squash. The difference in this dish is that it does not require you to make a roux with flour and butter and uses pureed roasted squash as the base for the cheese sauce. It actually works a lot better than regular mac and cheese, so if you have ever had Grandma make this for you, send her a thank you text. The Depression era had its fair share of seafood recipes, and sardines on toast was the star of the show. What's not to love about a quick, inexpensive, and protein-packed meal? The Depression days were all about making do with whatever came by, and sardines were not only light on the pockets but were long-lasting as well. The simple dish involved placing sardines, often with a bit of mustard or tomato sauce, on a slice of toasted bread. It was a practical solution during tough times and filled everyone's tummies with minimal effort. Thankfully, the Depression era is way before us, and sardines aren't our first choice for a go-to snack anymore, thanks to all the delicious options in the food aisle. Who wants sardines on toast when you could have a classic peanut butter and jelly sandwich? If there's one thing we've learned so far, it's that no one did seafood dishes quite like the French. The sole Veronique is the perfect example. Yeah, sole Veronique was a classic French dish that captured the essence of mid-20th century American fine dining. It was named after French opera singer Veronique, which gave it a whole new level of sophistication. The dish is known for its rich and creamy sauce, but a touch of lemon juice is what makes or breaks this delicacy. Oh, and if you want it as authentic as possible, don't forget the addition of grapes. These grapes were often poached or sautéed and added to the sauce to give it a subtle sweetness. Now, this dish isn't easy to come by anymore, but you'll definitely find some good recipes if you dust off your grandma's cookbooks.
And it's very tasty.
While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, hog's head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. This is one you have definitely heard about. Popeyes, Wendy's, KFC, or Burger King, There is nothing that hits that sweet spot in every corner of your head like some fried chicken does. Something about it makes it the perfect marriage between seasonings, oil, chicken, and breadcrumbs. You have probably tried this yourself too, but using baking powder on that chicken skin can get you some extra crispy zingers ready to go. Perfect for sandwiches, burgers, or just some chicken katsu curry. Ever feel like doing something extra with your chicken fillet? You know what to pull out of the cabinets. There's never been anything bad that came out of too much crispiness, except cholesterol issues and heart problems, but that's for like when you are 60 or something. Collard greens and ham hocks have been a combo that has very faithfully stood the passing of time, and we think it is partly due to all the different takes on it that families keep coming up with. You hear cabbage and your heart does not exactly burst with excitement, but collard greens is another story. Pair it up with smoky ham hocks and you have yourself a meal on a budget like no other. A ham hock itself is a portion of bone with connective tissue and some meat that is covered in fat and skin, and the other name for these is pork knuckles. With some sweet onions, garlic, and chicken broth, this was a recipe that would give any other dish a run for its money, and it was great for your diet too. Gotta make sure your grandkids grow up right and proper after all. The dish was brought to America by European immigrants and quickly became the talk of the town in the 1960s. However, this one didn't suit everyone's taste buds due to its unique texture of pickled herring. But hey, this one wasn't just a tasty treat, it gave you many benefits with each bite. Herring is a rich source of omega-3 fatty acids, which are beneficial for heart health, and the pickling process, while adding flavor, also helps preserve these nutrients, making it a nutritious choice. Next up, we have the lobster thermidor. Just the name sounds like something out of a fancy restaurant, right? Well, because it was the creation of one. Lobster thermidor is a classic French dish named after the Thermidor month of the French Revolutionary calendar, which corresponds to July and August. The dish was first created in Paris in the late 19th century, specifically in 1894 at the restaurant Marie's. It began to gain popularity as one of the more luxurious seafood options and quickly became a showstopper at any table. Bye-bye caviar. While the classic recipe includes brandy and mustard, some modern variations incorporate additional ingredients like truffle oil or different types of cheese. Lobster thermidor was a dish reserved for special occasions, the kind of meal you'd expect at a high-end restaurant or a lavish dinner party. And as prices soared, this one became limited to the elite class only. Restaurants typically don't offer it anymore unless you're an A-list celebrity with access to secret menus.
Pescado a la veracruzana.
Ah, sí.
Red snap.
Corned beef and cabbage. A classic St. Patrick's Day dish, but did you know it was once a common comfort food? Known as salt beef in some Commonwealth countries, this American-Irish dish was a hearty protein source and a staple on the table during the 17th through the early 20th centuries. It was tinned along with sugar and spices during World War I and World War II when fresh meat was rationed. Cabbage brought in the right amount of nutrients, making this meal not just delicious, but also a healthy choice. While still popular in some circles, corned beef and cabbage aren't half as famous as it once was. But if you're ever up for some good old-fashioned cooking, there are recipes for this one all over the internet and they're pretty easy to follow. And finally, we have stuffed lamb heart. This dish is another example of our ancestors' resourceful use of every part of an animal. This meaty meal also goes around with the unique nickname of love in disguise in many parts of England. While the origins are unclear, it first emerged in Kettner's Book of the Table in 1887 and took over Great Britain. The heart was cleaned, stuffed with breadcrumbs, herbs, and sometimes even minced meat, and then roasted or braised. This was a nutrient-rich meal which was a fulfilling delicacy after a long day of hard work. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Where would we be a nation without bread pudding? Especially the slow-cooked variant. Now, this dish is already well known for its soft and spongy consistency, which is part of why it has the name bread pudding. But slow cooking takes it up several notches. If you ever wondered what eating a cloud might feel like, we think this is the closest humanity will get to the experience. Using the bread as a cereal base and being slow cooked for around 2 to 3 hours, grandmas would often add an assortment of different nuts and spices to really get this dish shining as bright as it cold. Some raisins here, a touch of cinnamon and plump there, plus the freshest French bread you could get your hands on. All of it made for an incredible experience that made this the perfect brunch option to go for. And if you were not feeling brunch, it worked just as well as a breakfast or even late-night post-dinner snack. Mention gefilte fish in front of your grandparents because this one will definitely ring a bell. Its name comes from the Yiddish word gefilte, meaning stuffed, reflecting its origins where fish was traditionally stuffed with a mixture of ground fish and other ingredients. So, what even is this dish, you may ask? Well, it's basically made from a blend of ground fish such as carp, pike, and whitefish, mixed with ingredients like onions, eggs, and matzo meal. This one was traditionally served as a chilled appetizer by Ashkenazi Jewish households and was popular on Shabbat and Jewish holidays such as Passover. Gefilte fish has a long history in Eastern European Jewish communities, where it was a way to stretch fish further and create a flavorful dish for festive occasions. However, this delicacy wasn't limited to Jewish communities. It was also popular with German Catholics during Lent, when it was forbidden to eat meat. If you take a stroll down any of the beaches on the East Coast, you'll still hear whispers about the baked bluefish. Think of some good old-fashioned baked bluefish with breadcrumb stuffing. Of course, people loved it. Now, bluefish's high-fat content gives it a unique taste and makes it the star of the show, but it's the same fat content that made people raise eyebrows about this fan. Perhaps it's time to give the good old goose a chance to shine again. Sheep's head stew. Now, this is where things get a bit adventurous. This dish, once a staple in many cultures, involves cooking the entire head of a sheep, including the brain, eyes, and tongue. Yes, including. This one is a Scottish delicacy, also known as powsowdy, and was whipped up in Edinburgh, Scotland. Don't confuse it with the other powsowdy, which is a term for milk and meal boiled together. Dried peas and barley are other common ingredients used in this meaty dish. Sheep's head stew was often enjoyed in rural areas where nothing went to waste. Skinning the head and preparing it for the stew is a time-consuming task, and it can get messier, but if you manage to pull this one off, it is definitely worth getting your hands dirtier than usual. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Twice-cooked potatoes are firmly a thing of the past now, but that does not mean this video cannot serve as your inspiration to bring back this hit, which was especially popular with grandmas all around the country. Like we said with the previous dish, something being good for your health and tasty does wonders for its appeal, and grannies knows how to get the best of both worlds. Double cooking always had a benefit because it made them a lot easier to digest and increased their starch. They would prick the potatoes, cook, cool, then cook again before topping it off with green onions and bacon. An incredibly American idea, but also an extremely flavorful one. So do not hesitate to give this one a go.
Right to your kitchen.
So finnan haddie, or smoked haddock poached in milk in simpler words, was once a breakfast staple in New England. It's not an exaggeration to compare this to our favorite waffles because it was equally, if not more, popular. This dish has its roots in Scotland, where it was traditionally prepared by smoking haddock over peat fires, giving it a distinct, slightly sweet flavor. Finnan haddie was a popular staple for Scottish sailors and fishermen due to its long shelf life. The smoking process helped preserve the fish, making it an essential food for long voyages and hard times. In America, it became especially popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and was often served with boiled potatoes or on toast for breakfast. The poaching in milk gave the fish a creamy texture, which made it stand out from the other seafood dishes in the market. Well, there's no replacing everyone's beloved sunny side up nowadays, so this delicacy is nowhere to be found, unless maybe you visit Scotland. Grilled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Yikes! Honestly, it's just a win-win-win-win all around. And what else can you ask for in life? One of the most widespread hacks that got around like wildfire in the USA was the idea of speeding up the process of caramelizing onions by adding in some baking soda. Baking soda is a handy tool for many tasks, like softening vegetables or removing pesky stains. In the case of onions, it creates a pretty volatile pH environment, which helps the onions brown faster, better, and with a much richer flavor. This has to do with onions being more alkaline post-baking soda, and that really helps speed up the browning process. If you want to cut down on the prep time of your food without sacrificing the taste, and you find yourself putting in caramelized onions a lot, then this is one hack from Grandma to us to you. A recipe that is largely forgotten right now, but still made some noise back when it was really popular in the 20th century, is shrimp and grits. The secret to an incredible plate of these was all in the milk, butter, and cheddar cheese. Depending on the quality and how you handled it, you would ever have shrimp that had not really absorbed the flavor or the best seafood experience you could hope to have at home. Luckily, over many long years, the home cooks of our nation perfected the recipe and kept passing it down, one generation to the next. Some chopped bacon for a smoky flavor, or sausage drippings were also really popular picks for older chefs to run with. Grits would be made with dent corn and often boiled, then mixed with the butter and milk. How did your family make these if they ever did? Grew up in the Midwest, you might remember smelt fries as a popular snack or appetizer, especially in the spring when smelt was in season. But just in case you're new to this dish, smelt are small, oily fish that were once abundant in the Great Lakes, and frying them up was a simple and delicious way to enjoy them. In some states like Michigan, smelt fries were more than just a dish. They were part of local traditions and festivals. You could find them at food trucks and even concerts. They were the perfect finger food, crispy, salty, and satisfying. Unfortunately, they were replaced by other food choices that entered the market such as salmon and codfish. I wish we had enough space on our plates for all of them.
A classic Scottish meal that will bring the coasts of Scotland.
Love it or hate it, there's no denying that haggis is a unique and iconic dish. So, what does this dish consist of, you may ask? Well, this Scottish dish is made from sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, mixed with oats and spices, and cooked in a sheep's stomach. Yes, you heard that right. Robert Burns' poem, Address to a Haggis of 1786, made this meal Scotland's very own national dish and a literary classic. The dinner table. The typical scrambled eggs breakfast has been more or less a national tradition for so many years, it is impossible to tell where it really started. Low-key, small-time diners, high-tier French-American restaurants, and steakhouses all serve some kind of variation on eggs, including scrambled-ons. Hence, what do you do to add a little bit of variety, texture, and a bit of spaz to this classical option? If mayonnaise can work wonders for a burger, why not try it here? No, seriously, you'd be surprised. We know most people never make the link between eggs and mayo, but they can actually make them so much more fluffier and add this nice creamy texture too. If you do not believe us, then just search up any grandma's recipe for mayo eggs. Do not knock it till you try it. This wraps up my favorite 1600s recipes. Which recipe do you think deserves a space on menus in 2025? Comment below and don't forget to like and subscribe.